loving that Center for Documentary Studies has really stepped up this year, partnered with us. They're allowing us to use this space today for this panel, and also a week from today, there's another panel discussion here, which is also going to be introducing retail SMBs. So,
It's legal.
what's that?
It's legal practices, isn't it?
No, that's at the Frontier. The one next Saturday is the gallery model broken. A conversation exploring the artist-gallery collector relationship. That's going to feature Jim Swanson, Bill Schwab, Rick Wester, Maggie Triplett, and Dennis Keel. That's going to be moderated by our own Burk Uzzle over there. Always got to thank sponsors. 21C's been our presenting sponsor this year. They've done some great stuff. They have a great exhibition. They're hosting our portfolio reviews. We have guests in town that way. We also have a bunch of contact systems, Ventures, Al Thomas Jr., a handful of folks in this room are all sponsors of this great festival. We thank everybody for that. We do have some other immediate events coming up, which I'll share with you. A couple things later today. Steve, what's the thing? Tomorrow there is an opening at Horace Williams House in Chapel Hill. There's another event at Frank Gallery with Burn Voices of Jock Water and some other stuff that Barbara Tyler was involved with there. We rescheduled the Photo Review event. We remind us all when that is. The opening for that is going to be
Tomorrow at 6 to 9.
Tomorrow at 6 to 9. So it's on here, so just a change in date thanks to the weather. And then a really big event for us is this Tuesday is the Sheila Creek Wright event, which again, folks at CBS were very generous to help get her here. Great pop-up show that converted a alternative space into a great exhibition. She's giving an informal talk, and the official opening is 7 to 10 on Tuesday. So I hope you all make it out to that. I think that's all the business I have to attend to. Yes.
That one event that is 8 o'clock tonight is Reframing Food, a food youth initiative photo exhibit at the Carrick.
Thank you. Oh, and these handsome gentlemen in the back room are doing a documentary on Burk Uzzle, and they're going to be filming parts. So I hope you all are okay with having your images captured by them. If not, let us know now. But we appreciate them being here as well, guys. Appreciate it. With that, I'm going to turn it over to another Team Click member, panelist, and moderator for today's talk, Stephen Fletcher. Visual aids are now over.
Otherwise, we feel like we're at the grand position up here at 10 o'clock. Well, thank you all for coming here on a rather pleasant day outside. We hope to spend the better part of the next couple of hours here really addressing your needs and questions. I've asked all the panelists ahead of time to draw upon their experiences, but reminded them that it's not about their work, it's not about their career, it's about our knowledge and sharing that with you. And I'm going to, in a moment, start off with a set of questions, and I'd like to have a show of hands. Just I'm going to write down those the answers to those questions, just so that we have a sense of where you're coming from, and then that'll help us target the rest of the conversation. So a lot of today's success depends on you. I put that burden on you. But if you don't have any questions, we're just going to talk about our combined about 150 years worth of experiences. Telling up the numbers a little while ago, when you have all of our collective experience, it comes up to 148 years. So I'm going to start with introductions. We're going to each introduce ourselves very briefly, emphasis on briefly, so you have a sense of who we are and what we do. You mentioned my name is Stephen Fletcher. I started off with photography in junior high school. Went to RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, and majored in fine art photography. While I was there, I got interested in museums and computers. At the time, there was no such thing as an IBM PC, so I went to my advisor and told him that I wanted to take computer classes. He asked me why. I told him why. He said, let me do one thing better. He picked up the phone. He called the International Museum of Photography at the George Eastman House down the road and set up an independent study with them, a person by the name of Andy Eskin. And I was doing museum work on a couple days a week basis, and they happened to have somebody on the staff there who was also working on cataloging collections, and his name is Zogg, end of the table. And at the Jerry Grossman event the other day, we had a chance to reunite for the first time in 35 years, so it's really nice to see Del again. I went off and majored in museum studies, and I worked at 3 historical society type collections in California and Indiana, now here at UNC Chapel Hill, the photographic archivist for the North Carolina collection, where we have approaching 4 million items, and our most recent collection was the negative print archive from the Durham Herald Sun, 1.6 million negatives and about 500,000 prints. So we deal in big numbers. Also, my photography, I've not lost track of that at all. I'm a member of the VAE Photographers Forum in Raleigh. I have a show up currently in Carborough. So I'm still actively photographing as well as being an archivist. So I'll turn to my right and work our way down the table, and then we'll circle back and start the better part of the program. Burk.
I'm 150 years old, so I've been at it since I was 14 when I started making my living riding my bicycle with a speed graphic in the basket, taking pictures of tobacco barns burning down. And then would sell them to the News and Observer or whoever else would buy them. So from there on to News and Observer for a year, then went to Magnum. Went to Atlanta to become a freelance photographer with a 7-month-old, a wife 7 months pregnant, and $200 in the bank and 2 life was a great time to become a freelance photographer. Did that for a while in Atlanta, studied with a good guy, worked as an assistant. Then with Black Star for a year in Houston. At the end of that year, I was offered a contract by Life magazine, went to work with them when I was 23, worked with them for 6 or 7 years. Was invited to join Magnum, I did that for 15 years. And then I bailed out of all of that and became just self-contained lunatic with a camera. Lived with my life to take pictures independently. I live now in Wilson, North Carolina, where Janet Kagan, we have a beautiful place, 18,000 square feet of studio, gallery, dark room, huge big shoot studio, and an archive full of a lot of old prints, carefully and lovingly made for many years. And what is becoming now, I refer to in the deepest of my sleeps as a digital nightmare, as I'm now obviously having to segue into the digital world. Either that or learn how to take in washing to make a living. So I'm doing okay with that. It's a slow learning curve, but I'm loving it. They don't make my film anymore, so I'm 100% film now, digital now. And really having a great time doing it. And at this point, I should just get up and sit down with you folks. Because what I would learn from these folks, in just the most casual conversation, would be what I undoubtedly need to hear. So I would invite you folks to make all of us smarter.
Wow, big shoes to fill. Hi, I'm Chris Ogden. I've had 2 careers. One's in software development as a software executive, and the other's a full-time photographer. And they both they align very nicely and connect from a left brain, right brain perspective. I've done photography as an art form all my life. I got into computers and software, and love what computers can do. So did software to application development, multimedia, when these things were coming out. So did work with people like National Geographic Society. I did a bunch of DVD-ROMs that cataloged the world, and so photography was key assets and input to National Geographic or Simon & Schuster. people like that, a lot around training and learning and things like that. Did software development from an application standpoint, got into desktop publishing in 1984, bought my first Macintosh, serial number 676, and had a lot of PC stuff, but I've always been visually inclined that way, and so with the Macintosh, we could do all sorts of things in desktop publishing, and that started then managing assets, digital assets, for desktop publishing, taking old stripping and doing all that, labeling, things like that. So over the years, did that and decided, the photography thing has always been a love, and started that full time just over 10 years ago, sort of connecting left brain and right brain. In doing so, we've written custom software to manage assets. Back in the day, you needed multi-users, the ability to keyword search and things like that, old words like Canto, Cumulus, and things like that. iView Media Pro, which is now in its 5th iteration, we did custom programming for that. We got involved in Lightroom in the early days in the alpha when it was called Shadowland, using it both as a archiving, digital asset management. I may hear the term DAM, digital asset management. So I'm probably more in the digital world, although I've certainly managed a lot of analog stuff, both professionally and personally. Have a project we're dealing with about 15,000 snapshots of family photos. So we can go as an exhibiting artist. I'm a full-time photographer, fine art, landscape, and commercial work. I have a specialty in mines and quarries. So each of those has a different need of being able to put your hands quickly on an asset. So is this going to be a show, a fine art show? Is this going to be in a magazine? Is it going to be, so how do you could have, I think I looked last night, my main Lightroom catalog has just shy of 400,000 images in it. 400,000 images, wow. So with digital we have this avalanche of assets. How do we manage those things? More importantly, how do we find it? So I basically have sort of two focus. One is the searchability in terms of meta keywording data, so you can find the stuff you're looking for. And then, of course, the other is how do you manage things. My cousin is a restorer at the National Gallery, doing Rembrandts and things like that. So got into collecting fine art Japanese prints. So the things like acidity and heat and the whole long thing. So physical as well as the searchability. So that's what turns me on. Thanks.
I'm the dinosaur of the group. Well, I'm almost as old as Burk, but not quite. I don't know what to say after that. I have nothing to. I don't even know what you were talking about. I refer to myself as a lapsed photographer. I started working at the George Eastman House 35 years ago. Worked there for 22 years, and then went off to Houston to work with Ann Wilkes Tucker, who was the founding curator of the photography department at the Museum of Fine Arts of Houston. Worked there for another 13 years, and ended up, after 35 years, I said, that's enough, I'm going to retire. And so I've been retired for a little over a year now. I'm available for weddings, funerals, and stuff, as they say, but I'm trying to start a consulting business to help people either own their collections, learn how to care for their collections, learn how to store their collections, and when they get to a certain point, learn how to dispose of their collection through legal means. What else? That's pretty much it.
He sent me a whole page, so he's being modest. He had a lot of stuff in there, so hopefully some of that additional material.
I will be happy to answer any and all questions.
Yeah, we'll come up through the day. Well, as I mentioned, we had some questions, and it was mainly to help get a sense of why you're here and what kind of material you work with. So I'm going to just try to do some real quick counting as you answer. So here we go. How many people here have a sizable negative collection of their past work? There's a good chunk of the day. Okay.
Should we answer too?
Sure, if you want.
Well, Burk, I know, has got quite
Burk's got quite a few.
I've got a few.
I've got a lot less than Burk, and we don't move on, probably. But how many people currently still shoot film? Roughly half, I think, okay. How many currently are still making prints in a traditional darkroom? smaller. So some people farm that out. I'm not counting exact numbers, by the way. There's like a quarter, a half, 2/3 kind of. How many people make prints using alternative processes? How many people know what alternative processes means? Okay. All right, so a few, about a fifth. How many people are scanning their older negatives to create digital versions? Good chunk, okay, about half. I'm saying that for the people in the front who can't see what's going on behind me. How many are, this is slightly different than the question I just asked, how many people are scanning their current negatives as opposed to your older negatives in order to make digital prints? How many people shoot primarily with digital photographs, digital photography? Okay, only about a third. How many of those of you who are just shooting digital, how many of you only shoot JPEG? Oh, bless your hearts. We have kindred spirits.
That's your archival stocking.
Yeah, that's how many people then shoot raw formats? Okay, of those of you who have your hand up, how many shoot DNG in camera? Okay.
Oh, aren't you
Can you explain it?
I will in a moment, yes. So how many are then shooting other proprietary raw formats like Canon, Nikon? Okay. The reason I put up my hand is I shoot Pentax. And Pentax and I think Leica and a couple other cameras at tops have the ability to save your raw files as Adobe's DNG format. So that's why I wanted to get a sense of that.
And the iPhone now.
And the new iPhone is actually, as he's going to try, it's going to have DNG in it. So if it's something that we should probably spend some time trying to pretend we understand. At least building the awareness.
6 of them.
Okay, so how many people who shoot raw then convert to DNG? Very few, about 4 people. How many people are making inkjet prints? Good number, okay. All right, the reason I ask that is a lot of people shooting today don't even make prints anymore. They just don't. How many of you, we need to do my next question, how many people only share work on websites? In other words, you don't print, you just share your work on your own website or some other website. 1, 2, 3, 4, okay. How many people here have had a solo show? Good number, that's weird. Well, that means
Long time ago. Before I lapsed.
Pardon?
Before I lapsed.
Yes. And then this was just to help get the number bigger. How many have been part of a group show? So nearly everyone. How many people submit work to jury shows? There we get into questions like, are you using contracts? Do you have shipping issues? Do you know how do you track what you send out? All that kind of stuff. How many people are a member of a camera club? 1, 2, 3. Okay. And how many people here are students? 0. Okay. I guess it's a pretty good sense of what we're looking at. So with that,
You,
yes.
you left out a category of how many people collect photographs.
Okay. How many people here collect photographs?
Oh, because I'm
5. Okay, so what we're going to do now, we're going to break the day roughly into thirds. We're going to, especially since there's a lot of people doing, still shooting film, we're going to talk about what I still refer to as traditional photography, what other people are starting to refer to as analog. And then we're going to move from that to scanning. Those of you who are scanning your negatives and saving those digitally. And then we'll move into digital photography and digital printing. I'm going to start off with just a couple of comments, turn to anyone here in the panel who wants to respond to that. If you hear something, you have a question, please raise a hand. and we're going to try to address your questions in the flow of the conversation, so you're not just sitting there listening to us drone on for an hour and a half. Okay? Very good. So the thing I want to start off with, as a traditional photography archivist, I give workshops a lot on to people working in cultural institutions, and the categories that I break that workshop down into, besides the historical formats, which I won't necessarily get into right now, are the physical structure of photographs, which is essentially why the other parts are important. I talk about temperature, humidity, storage, and to some extent light. So the important thing about photographs from a physical structure, we're photographers, we're used to looking at the image, thinking about the image. We tend not to think about the physical structure of a print. Traditional photographic print is something that we refer to as as layers. So it's a laminate structure. You have a paper base, or a film base, or a glass base, something that it keeps the emulsion adhered to that base, or in the case of some of the early photographic processes, they don't exist. The photographic sensitive material, like salt prints, is actually right in the paper filings. And so, as I teach the workshop, I actually pass the photograph around and I ask them, how do you think about a photograph, or how do you look at a photograph? And then I take it and I look at it from the side as if I'm looking at this piece of paper like this. And that's how I spend the rest of that workshop, talking about things from this perspective. And why that's important is because if you have temperature, humidity issues where your temperature is going up and down and your humidity is going up and down, all those layers are reacting to those changes differently because they're made of different materials, they're different thicknesses, and over time, and now I'm talking to people who are dealing with glass plate negatives and acetate negatives and nitrate negatives and older photographic prints that are not on boards. As those very microscopic type of levels, those things are expanding in interaction, the item is actually starting to break down. And so those changes we call cycling. If you're going up and down with your temperature and humidity, you have cycling. So the first thing you want to try to do is store your materials in a place that is cool and dry and has as constant a temperature and relative humidity as you can. Then, in terms of the storage of those materials, you want to be using things that, if it's in contact with photographic emulsion, passes something that's known as the PAT, or the Photographic Activities Test. It is a test that was developed by the Image Permanence Institute out of Rochester Institute of Technology, what that test does is looks for the material that is in contact with an emulsion to see whether or not there is any interaction between those. And if it doesn't interact, then it passes that test. So if you are buying things that are called archival, that may not be enough. The paper might still have sulfur content in it, or other waste products in paper making that don't get cleaned out, that are just fine with things like documents, but can react with photographic emulsions. And some photographic emulsions are actually more sensitive to these things than others. So things like paper cyanotypes and color materials, some of these are more reactive than, say, a traditional black and white archival process photograph. So those are the things I wanted to make sure that if you did nothing else today and learned anything else today and went home, that you would understand at least that you need to explore this more in terms of your collecting of historical material as well as preserving your own, that you want to be sure you're using materials that are more than just acid-free or archival, that pass this photographic activities test, and that you have your temperature and humidity under control. Light is a little bit different in terms of having things on display or not, and we can get into that a little later on. We're going to be talking about your printing. But with that introduction, I'll turn it over to folks here. Is there anything you want to add to what I just described?
No, I mean, I think that you've covered the basics. You have to be careful where you obtain those materials from. And from my experience working at museums, there's several organizations. One of them is called University Products, another one's called Conservation Resources, Gaylord Products. Gaylord actually supplies things to libraries and archives. That's very good. And then there's another small company. When I first was in Rochester, I worked at a small company that some of you may have heard of in the past. It's called Light Impressions. And they used to sell archival quality materials. The problem with the current incarnation of Light Impressions is that it was sold by the original founders to some company in California who basically sold people the cheapest stuff they could find and labeled it as archival. And so I would not recommend buying anything from Light Impressions other than the fact that if you've got any experience, yes.
Could you repeat the three?
Sure.
Yeah.
First one's University Products. The second one's Conservation Resources. And the third is Gaylord Products, Gaylord. And then there's another small organization that kind of stepped in when Light Impressions kind of was sold and moved out of Rochester. It's called Archival Methods, which is a company that was founded by a fellow that used to work with me at Light Impressions. His name's Dennis Inch, who wrote a book called The Life of the Photograph, which gives you kind of all this kind of archival information that's good to know. I don't know if it's still available, but it was back then. So it's kind of be leery of people bearing false witness on the quality of their products, I guess is. Photographic activity test is probably the best method of determining whether something will react. Like Stephen said, there are certain kind of materials that it will react differently with. Things can pass the photographic activity test and still not be comparable or compatible with things like Cibachrome or Ilfochrome prints. That tends to, for some reason, it tends to enhance the silver mirroring or the transmission of the emulsion up through the surface of the paper. So, you know, if you learn nothing else today, is to be skeptical about things labeled archival.
How do you know? I mean, since archival, you think you're safe, but then you find out you're not safe. So how do you know that it passes these tests?
Usually, the people that sell the materials, I know all of the 4 places that I have listed will say that this material passes the photographic activity test. And so that's a good way to kind of determine whether you should look at this work or not. If it's not listed as passing the photographic activity test, then, you know, question the source and say, has this been tested?
Is archival and acid-free the same thing?
No. I mean, there's lots of nat board out there that basically will be labeled as acid-free, and it's only because somebody has tested it and said, oh, it's neutral, so it's not, it's acid-free, but it's not acid-free if it's just neutral on the pH scale, so it still may have some acid. And things can be acid-free today, but 10 years from now, if it's not stored correctly and put in excessive moisture or heat, that may change. You know, the paper, the board may absorb enough moisture that some kind of chemical reaction may take place in that board to make it not acid-free. So it's best to start with a known entity. Usually museums, in my experience is all museums use rag board. There is such a thing as called conservation board, which has been acid neutralized, re-washed and redone this, but it's not necessarily the same quality as the rag board. So I would go with rag board. It's more expensive, but it's, you know, you're using this for something that you want to last forever. So, I mean, what's a few more cents?
Thank you.
Burk, were any of these the sorts of concerns you were thinking about when you were building your photo bomb shelter?
I was just going to ask him.
Well, the photographic activities test brings to mind how Magnum got started. Magnum got started because there were these 4 wonderful photographers taking photographs a mile a minute with film, and they wanted a place to put them because they realized that something was going on. They were friends, and so they formed Magnum. And the photographic activities test Magnum had to do under which girlfriend's bed were the negatives in contact. So that's in fact how the Magnum archive got started. All the negatives and contact sheets were stored for quite a while under the beds of whatever apartment happened to be occupied at the time by either the photographer or someone very close to the photographer. So photographic activities being what they are, photographers being the kind of people they are. Sooner or later, this kind of got out of hand. Sooner or later, they had to realize, well, we have to, put a roof over this stuff, and Magnum was formed, and it really had to do with copyright as much as photographic activities. But it certainly does bring to mind that you gotta take care of the stuff. I mean, I've been at this, longer than anybody in King County anymore. But I did, when I moved to Wilson, bought a couple of old buildings, and one of which is an old freight elevator pit, and had the floor kind of filled with concrete, so that there's this much concrete at the bottom of the thing, and then we built an inner room of cement block, and every cement block is filled with sand, so that it is truly, there's a mini split to keep the temperature clear and clean, and it's a dehumidifier, so it's really very carefully monitored. And the ceiling also has a whole shitload of concrete, over which is a tin roof. So for those of you who are in the neighborhood, when the whistle blows and it's about to hit the fan, and you need a place to be safe. There's a bathroom. I said, go to the bathroom and then join me in the archive. And the photographic activities will have to do with preservation of all these prints, which I'm very careful about. It's it has 55, gaining quickly on 60 years of prints and negatives and contact sheets, all except those which are collected by the Library of Congress. But I take really good care of it. I learned how to file the negatives and keep them in order by the story name and year name and all that. And so that's what I've got in life is my archive.
I was trying to think of a way when I first learned about this photography bunker that I could bring that down to like those of us who don't have photography bunkers. And what Burk has done.
Pull the audience to see how many others.
Yeah, how many people in the audience have a photo bunker? But really, what it is on a grand scale is a wonderful example of what we call microclimates. So what he has is like a layer with a layer with a layer. So when you have your negative inside a paper envelope, which is in the box with a bunch of other negatives that are in paper envelopes, and then you have that box inside of another box. Then you have that box in an area that is with temperature and humidity level are as under control as you can get that to be. You create these layers of barriers. So if there is a spike, you've got all these layers that can help absorb and slow down that cycling process. So that the box that those negatives are in, for example, they'll take the brunt if your AC goes out for a short period of time and your humidity starts to rise. Your box is going to absorb some of that and help slow that process down. And that's what we call microenvironments or microclimates. So he did it on a very grand scale. So that's the advantage of using these envelopes in boxes and in a box is to sort of help counter those fluctuations that you may have in a typical home where you do have the air conditioning going. And it is somewhat constant, but helps to even out those changes outside.
And I think the current climate of understanding photographic conservation is that it doesn't necessarily have to be as cold as some museum or archival climates currently are, as long as it stays relatively stable.
The constant is more important than the targets. I'd give you the targets, what they are, but most people don't like living in those kind of conditions. They're usually somewhere around 50, 55 degrees Fahrenheit for black and white material, and even colder for color. and we just don't function well at that level. So what's more important again is that constancy. And the story I always tell in my workshops that that brings this home. The relative humidity level that's ideal for photographs is somewhere around 35%. So in Indiana, we had a really cold stretch, and on one of the shelves that was outside of the vault area, there was a photograph, and that photograph was a 19th century type print that was on a board and mounted on a board, and the board had this crease running through it, and the relative humidity just kept dropping and dropping and dropping, and we were down to just below 20%. And the board actually cracked. The photograph did not tear, but the board itself cracked. So I called a colleague of mine who works in Arizona, and I said, I've got relative humidities that are just plummeting way below where they should be. What should I do? Because I figure he's in a place where it's pretty dry, right? He would know. He says, if I got up to where you are, I'd have a major tragedy on my hands. Because he's used to having everything being 5%, 10% or something, just naturally. So what he would experience would be this spike from 5, 10%, all the way up to like double. So what's more important, he's at 5%, 10%, he needs to keep it there. Because that's the environment in which he's from. That cycling is actually, controlling that cycling is the most important thing. The other numbers are like targets for museums and potentially homes, but more important, keep it from cycling.
Does this have to do with all materials, or are you thinking primarily of silver gelatin prints and the analog work? What about inkjet prints, and what about Seagrams, and what about sea prints, and all of the rest? Are we speaking of photographic materials generally, or how specific is this discussion to?
And slides.
Yeah, color slides, color negatives. At this point, I'm talking primarily about traditional photographic formats like our films and our.
But I mean, inkjet photographs and Seagrams,
right.
Ilfochrome prints are on a different kind of substrate. But I think the conservators will tell you that basically treating them the way a traditional chromogenic print would be treated for the Ilfochrome and Seagrams prints, and for the inkjet prints, because you really don't know, and it's paper for the most part. And basically, if you can keep it relatively stable in a controlled environment, it's going to age a lot slower than anything else. That's the reason why the cold temperatures for color prints are used, because it slows down the chemical reaction of the materials that are still left in the print after it's been processed. And if it gets warmer, those reactions, like anybody, I'm not a chemistry major, but chemists can tell you that if temperature increases, the activity of the reaction increases. So if you can slow it down and keep it at a minimal level of even starting to decompose, it'll extend the life of that object. Nothing lasts forever, but archives and museums are charged with maintaining this thing in perpetuity, whether it's reasonable or not. But you give it the old college try, as they say, and basically use whatever conservation science you can at time to maintain those objects for as long as humanly or physically possible. Like paper's going to decompose over time. Daguerreotypes are going to tarnish over time. Everything's going to go away. I mean, daguerreotypes have lasted 175 years so far, with little or no problems, other than the fact that they do tarnish if air is allowed to get in past the seal. That's the reason that daguerreotypists used to put that paper seal on it between the cover glass and the back of the image to keep air from infiltrating. And if you look at daguerreotypes, the way they do decompose is the tarnish starts from the outside where the air filtrates in, and it kind of sooner or later consumes the whole image.
How much can you trust the accelerated aging of photographic materials done by people like Wilhelm and so forth, when they put an archival date on certain papers and things?
Well,
I mean, do you feel this is gospel? Is it a hand?
It's a crapshoot. I mean, I will throw out the caveat that I I'm still mad at Henry Wilhelm because basically, it seems like 50 or 60 years ago when he was making print washers, I ordered a print washer from him and he went out of business making print washers. And I never got my money back. So I'm a little skeptical that, but he seems to have found this niche doing accelerated aging tests for companies that make inkjet paper. So I think that's pretty much what his business recommends. IPI is also doing the same kind of accelerated aging tests on inkjet prints, but they also are in the process of telling people how to repair them, replace them, you know, knowing how long it's going to last. I mean, the dye-based inkjet prints last a lot less amount of time than pigment-based inkjet prints. So that's another thing. That's why things have changed from the dye-based that, you know, Mash Editions was using dye-based inks and their, whatever they used to call them.
So let me do a little bit of interpretation, because a lot of stuff just went through there. How many people are not familiar with Henry Wilhelm? Henry Wilhelm. Okay, so Henry Wilhelm has written a book which is no longer in print, that you can get it for free as a PDF. On essentially, it has a very long title, but essentially it's on preserving color photographic material. But it also works with black and white material, and he gets into everything like cold storage vaults at 0, which is close to where we are now.
Thank you.
Bryce is fixing
Thank you,
that.
Bryce.
But Henry Wilhelm has been testing color and materials for their longevity. And accelerated aging tests is no one's going to be around for 100, 200, 300 years to know how long this material is going to last. So people like he and his Permanent Institute do testing in a fashion that tries to accelerate the aging process by forcing the relative humidity and temperature in different directions to then see how the material reacts and then extrapolate out from that. Okay, based on what I saw happen over the past year, if I take that out, it should last X number of years. So those are the two things I want to make sure didn't get lost in the.
I think these are great comments. A couple things I'd add. One is lowest common denominator, right? So the weakest link in your system is going to cause the biggest issue. Now, I love photography to see it, right? So while I do have flat file drawers and all these various things too, I want it up on the wall. And as soon as you put it up on the wall, you also have UV, which we really haven't talked about, you know, very much. So the ultraviolet rays, so, you know, if you get UV protected glass and so forth, or glaze. But it really is the lowest common denominator. So when you pick your frame shops, as was pointed out by Dell, you know, they'll use words like archival and buffered and this and that, and it's really hard to cut through what the truth is. So, you know, you could use archival foam core and archival mat board and archival this and that, but if one element in the package when you're framing something has acid in it, you're going to see it pretty darn quickly. Now, we're talking mostly about still photography. Let's also talk about, you know, where there is the dye versus the pigment, right? The pigment sits on top of the paper, right, like an inkjet, and that's dries and hardens versus the dye is in the fibers. But there's also this idea of magnetic media. So if you have VHS tapes out there, you better get them turned over pretty quick, because they lose 10 to 20% of their magnetic life in 10 years. So those VHS tapes that you have, those are going bad, okay? Similarly to, I've got a bunch of 8mm, 16mm, and so forth. So it's the lowest common denominator that you really need to be thinking about. Your oils from your skin. When we sell our limited edition sort of high-end fine art prints, I always include a pair of cotton gloves, because as soon as you touch that, then you're starting to create fungus, you know, places for fungus to grow. So really it's this trade-off between, you could have sort of long live prints in the dark, you know, like mushrooms, if you will, but never see them. So how do you handle those changes? The other thing, if a lot of people are printing on canvas, we were one of the first people in the Southeast to do those inkjets. Some people call them, you know, giclée. Does everyone know about giclée? Giclée is actually a French word which means to spray, but in parlance it means to pee. Okay, so to piss, and so that's really what it is. And so you got to be careful about that. A lot of the canvases you'll get today have OBAs, optical brightening agents, in them. So they'll look great and nice and white now, But even as 7 years out, it turns yellow. So it's really difficult to find, light impressions, as was said, used to be great. So it's difficult to find sort of what that best common denominator is. But watch out for the acid, right? The acidity of things. Even if you take and so you have the whole package of the frame, and you put a hinge on it, right, to hang it. Oh, goodness gracious, don't lay it down, right? Don't dry mount it unless you can reprint that image. But if you hinge it, if those hinges are bad, it's going to leave yellowing and so forth. So it really is that lowest common denominator. But again, to me, photographs are meant to be viewed. So at the end of the day, what do you do?
If we're viewing a bullet in the digital, let's come back and ask some hands up. Tim?
Yeah, Burk, I'm really, one of the things I adore about you is your lack of sentimentality sometimes when switching between film and digital, and you're so practical about this. I'm wondering, from your experience with looking at scans of your negatives, do you view sort of drum scans or high resolution scans of some of your older negatives as approaching the quality of what you can then get from print? How do you think about that, and would sort of scanning your entire archive sort of make the bunker redundant?
I have not scanned personally any of my own black and white negatives. I have had people do that with selected negatives that really know what they're doing. But I've just never really gotten around to it, and it's a mountain that I've got to climb pretty quickly, because as I get older, and my death will be possibly the end of the kind of care that I would give those old negatives in a very personal way. I've always kept a pretty active darkroom, and as the key negatives, what I call the master file, pictures that have been in shows or books or whatever. I've tried to keep up with prints on those key negatives, have a kind of box of modern prints of the most important things, as well as a box of the original prints, which are mostly set aside for museums. So I'm almost completely out now of what I would call the good archival prints of the key pictures. The ones I've got, I would probably sell only to museums now. And I would make modern prints of the key negatives. And I've been doing that. And frankly, those prints are way better now than the ones I made before, because the papers are better, the developers are better. But it means that, when I die, then I've got to think about what happens to those negatives. And that's certainly a discussion that I'm having with people. And, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't really want to take the time to do it, because I'm a very active photographer. I've got a deciding commission I'm doing now. I'm doing new work all the time. We've got, there's just a lot happening. And what's left of my life now is been taking pictures or making great prints in the dark and learning how to make great prints with an inkjet print. So the notion of scanning negatives is something that, though I understand its importance, I will absolutely delegate that to somebody I trust, like one of the several great labs I've worked with over the years. I've got to find a way to do this. Not only the gazillion negatives I've got to do, the key ones. Let's face it, we take a lot of bad pictures in our life. And, I once looked at every contact sheet that Henri Cartier-Bresson ever shot when I was a magazine photographer. And there are a lot of really terrible photographs. The good ones are incredible. But, to watch how his mind worked and see the good ones coming out of the adventure of exploring the situation. But I don't know that we need to save all the bad ones, except for somebody who wants to figure out, okay, that, even the best are really bad on, about 80% of the time. So,
Well, there's that old story of Robert Frank when he's traveling across the country shooting the Americans in the 50s. And stopped in somewhere in Washington State, I think it was, maybe Seattle, to develop this film, Wayne Miller's Dark Room, excuse me. And Wayne Miller has this picture of Robert Frank looking at his negatives and basically snipping out the ones he knows aren't any good.
Yeah.
Basically, he just threw them in the trash.
Absolutely, no, I do that.
Right. So I mean, that's what not enough people have done over the years. Not enough people, I mean, that's part of being, I mean, you know as well as any person who's ever struggled with photography knows it. It's knowing which one is the one that you want people to see and move it on. I mean, the interesting thing about Robert Frank is that every time he republished The Americans, there's one or two pictures that he changes every time. And basically it's like the famous one that was published in the first edition, and then the one that's the next picture on the roll of the one that was prior to that. And that's the one he uses for the second edition. And it's, if you look at them closely, there's a slight variation in every one of those publications.
Well, not to dwell on Henri too much, but one of the interesting things about looking at his contact sheets, and to your point, one of the things you would see in his work is you would see him establish the architecture for the photograph. In the case of the line goes this way, and the front is going to be here, and the lens is here, and I'm either up or I'm down, and he would establish the architecture for the frame, and that which is going on in the frame. And then you'd see him work and work and work, maybe a little here, a little there, and then you see the people coming by, and then you see what he beautifully called the decisive moment. Very often the picture he would select would be not the geometrically, graphically, absolutely to the T perfect frame. It would be something that's very often a little bit off to keep more energy in it. And that was a lesson in itself.
So to translate into your practices.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, this is great. This is great. So and I know I want to do digital and it's traditional and it's scanning, but we're jumping all over the place. But in the archival world, we call that appraisal. We go through, we try to decide what to keep and what not to keep. And you might find it shocking, but we can't keep everything. So you have this balance between what should we keep so that we can show the mind of how the photographer worked, and is that important? And when is that important? And when is that like not important? Or when was the mind not even at work? For example, I was going through the Herald Sun negatives the other day looking for an important image for a researcher, and I kept seeing like every so many envelopes, cat of the week. We are not going to spend money on our little seats and proper storage and real estate shelf space for cats of the week.
Is there any cat lovers who will give Stephen some money?
Be
So that whole
careful though. I mean, Cat of the Week is getting to be a pretty dominant cultural movement.
But the point that I wanted to bring here is that some of this comes down to your practice. Are you going back and looking at your work on a regular basis to figure out, okay, how did I approach a topic? What worked? What didn't? In those instances, you're going to be wanting to keep your negatives, and you're going to want to keep them in a way that you can access them and study them and learn from them when you want to do that. If you're of the mindset that, hey, I shot this, that job is done, I am on to the next thing, then periodically you should be going through your files and reading the things that you don't need, so that you don't, 20, 30, 40, 55 years from when you started, have this massive, headache on it or burden on yourself. So it really comes down to, how you utilize your work.
But there is also the joy of going back through your work and discovering a picture that you completely overlooked 5 years ago.
Right.
And say, how did I miss this?
Yeah, and I know we're in the analog world, and I respect that. At the same time, when you take the analog resources or the digital resources, as the technology changes, you can pull information out of an image that you simply couldn't get. So, if we look at, let's say, Adobe Lightroom, for instance, they're in their third process version, which I've gone back 10 years ago and found an image, to your point, like, oh, that looks cool, but no, it's technically wasn't good. It was blown out. It was this. But now, with the tools, you can actually go and make usable images. So going back to an ancient Canon 10D little 4 megapixel digital SLR, you know, I can now get pretty decent prints, 24 by 36, out of that with the new technology. So it's a tricky thing, and you're right, there's a cost. There isn't a cost now digitally to keep everything, but there's this mental and just how you slog through it. And so that's a tricky balance. Oftentimes what we say is get rid of anything that's obviously defective, you know, is unintentionally blurred or, you know, totally blown or something. But it's tricky. That's how you get hundreds of thousands of images.
And then there's also the practicality if you've got a strip of 6, and there's only one frame that's any good on there. It's easier to put a strip of 6 into your negative carrier than it is an individual frame. You know, so a lot of photographers keep it all just for the sheer ability to fingerprints. And that, yeah, if you know there's something not good, put your fingerprints on the ones that aren't any good. Yes, you have a question.
I find light really effective before going into a dark room. I get really impatient with doing like test strips and making contact prints. So when I scan in my negatives, I'm like, all right, I see my highlights, I see my greatest light, I see my dark rooms. I kind of know already what I want to do in the dark room. And that's helped me a lot just as far as A, time, and B, kind of better understand the negative itself. So it's great going back to old negatives, scanning those in, seeing exactly, all right, what can I do with this? Kind of make those adjustments on the computer, seeing the best I can get out of that, and being able to go into the dark room and do that physically, it kind of makes a really easygoing process and a lot more fun to see the different sides of merging those two techniques together.
One thing I want to make sure that I don't get lost in this, and I'm just going to mention it. I refer to it as the acronym. I always have to look up the full name. But for those of you who are scanning your negatives, you should read the latest. It's still considered technically it's still considered a draft. But I refer to it as FADGI. A lot of people refer to it as FADGI, F-A-D-G-I. It stands for Federal Agencies Digitization Guidelines Initiative. It's Federal Agencies Digitization Guidelines Initiative. And they get into to scanning, the technical aspects of scanning, what levels of resolution and such that you should be scanning your negatives for. And the old way they used to do it was what I crudely call the equivalent of the old 4x5 copy negative, which was, you know, it served a purpose. But this particular draft, they've now moved into the realm of digitization as preservation. So the highest end, the 4-star rating that they use, in some ways, some of the technology doesn't even exist yet to get your negatives scanned to the level, unless the 100 megapixel cameras are now starting to get to the point where some of the film formats can reach something that would be considered preservation quality. But nonetheless, it's very good about giving you scanning resolutions and stuff for different formats of film. So 35 millimeters, got different issues or settings than you would for a 4x5 or an 8x10, those kinds of things. So I would highly recommend that they're available free, just to Google and download, but be sure you're reading the most current version, even though the current draft, even though it's not fully adopted yet. It's a very good document to consult to be sure that you're scanning your negatives at a technically satisfactory level. It's a deep pull. I don't want to go too deep into it. We'll lose the whole hour that remains, but it's a good document for you to consult. Yes, Bryce. Yes, I know, but I've been trying to get to our regular, our visitors as opposed to our regulars. Yes, Bryce.
So okay, now you have all your film. It's an archival stuff, and temperature controlled, you know, bomb shelters and all that stuff. And since we're still hopefully talking about film, one of the great things about digital is how you can easily sort of access, cross-reference everything. But for those of us that are still shooting film, just like to maintain a way to get access to the stuff you know. I mean, certainly the volume of stuff, you know, you said earlier, sleeve that says story year on it. But if you're just shooting, not stories, if you're just shooting, if you're just, how do you guys store, catalog, access, kind of know where to go find that negative when you need it, when you're still just working with film-based
little job was to keep track of the negatives in the George Eastman House collection, which numbered approximately 200,000 objects, ranging from 4 by 5 foot glass plate, gelatin glass negatives, to 35 millimeter, to any format that anybody ever donated. You gotta remember, the Eastman House was opened in 1947. And for a number of years, it was the only game in town. If you were interested in photography, you made that pilgrimage to Rochester and you spent as much time there as you could, because chances are, if you wanted to see a Hessives print, they'd have more than one. Because basically, even when I started in 1981, and even after I started, I often still got calls from people saying, my father and my grandfather were run a portrait studio or a photography studio of some kind. For their entire lives, they're gone now. I don't want to run the studio anymore. Is there anything you'd be interested in? And 9 times out of 10, they talk to them on the phone, they put somebody in a big truck and they drive to wherever they were, and they spend a week sorting through the stuff and bringing things back. You gotta remember, the Eastman House collects anything photographic. They collected negative carriers, they collected cameras, they collected lenses, they collected, darkroom trays, they collected enlargers. They've got, they have the first digital camera that was ever created by a scientist over at Kodak, and basically when he showed it to his boss, they said, nobody's ever gonna not shoot film. There's no need for this. And luckily, he was smart enough to patent the technology for the little sensors on the back of your digital cameras now. So anytime somebody buys a new digital camera, that's one of Kodak's patents. And Kodak's still making money out of it, even though it's basically a totally different company than it was years ago. And they always said, oh, we don't need to be a digital company. But that's what they're surviving. So the Eastman House was the place to come if you wanted to study the history of photography, because at one point, one of the donors to the Eastman House had this huge collection of daguerreotypes. He happened to be in France. He donated his wife sold them to the Eastman House. Actually, she sold them to the Eastman Kodak Company. The Eastman Kodak Company then turned around and said, we're going to make this Mr. Eastman's mansion into a photography museum. And they took all these things that they had as examples in the research labs and donated them to the Eastman House. So at one point, the Eastman House had more French daguerreotypes than the Bibliothèque Nationale. And so it's just an amazing place to go if you're interested in photography. And the interesting thing is it's still all pretty much available. You can make an appointment. If you know what you want or have an idea as to what you want, you call one of the archivists, and they'll be happy to arrange a day, a week, a month, depending on how long you can stay and how much patience you have. When I went to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, they're one of the few museums in the country that has a complete set of Robert Franks, the Americans. They have all 85 of the photographs, 83 I think it is actually, but so you can make an appointment and go, and they can bring you out the boxes with those 83 photographs on them. And unfortunately, they were acquired over a number of years, and then kind of after years of collecting Robert Franks photographs, they realized that they had a complete set, and they set those aside as a special thing. But they're prints from several different printings. I mean, Robert got got a bad reputation because at one point in his career he needed money, and he sold a whole lot of prints to a couple of dealers in Washington, and basically they just came to his place down in the Bowery with a truck and took them all away, and Robert didn't even have the time to go through them and throw away the ones that he thought were terrible prints. So there's a whole bunch of Robert Frank pictures out there that are in terrible conservation conditions, because Robert was one of those people who stored things under his bed in his loft in the Bowery. And basically when he left to go up to Nova Scotia, he turned the heat off, and left. And so basically the temperature and humidity fluctuated. Some of them are in terrible condition, and Robert then at one point, when he got wealthy enough, he tried buying a lot of those things back from the dealers, but the dealers had already sold a bunch of them. still haunted by that fact that there's things. Yes, ma'am.
So this is maybe a two-part question. For those of us still working in a traditional darkroom, I'm curious if you keep printing notes for every print that you make. Every time you reprint it, do you make additional notes? And would anyone be able to duplicate that print with those notes? And when permanent institutions acquire portfolios, do you search for printing notes? Do you care about having it on file as well?
I'll let you go first.
When I make prints, I do keep very careful notes on the contact sheets. You know, what paper, what contrast, what development time, where the dodging and burning is all done. So they're really very carefully documented. So somebody probably could come and duplicate my prints pretty carefully. The other thing I would do is, speaking about how do you keep up with it all, back to your question, very early on, I became very conscious of keeping the key pictures in a box. And when I would do a project and I would have the selects, I would keep that box as best I could intact. And there was a point in my life when I realized that I just done so much, I had to kind of get a lasso around it. And I did a good, quick, flatbed scan of several hundred prints that were what I considered my best work up to that point in my life. And I forget what software I used, but in the old days, these were all printed out in little tiny contact sheets, a lot on a page with the frame number, the title, where the pictures, how many prints I had, where they're stored, what boxes, and what now digitally would be the metadata, that you'd have with Lightroom or Capture One, whoever you're working with, whatever your software is. But I did that manually by hand with analog materials. And I have duplicate loose leaf, 3-ring binders that are about this thick, one of which used to live with the gallery that I was formerly with. But it has, hundreds of contact sheets. Of little pictures of, all of Woodstock, all of Martin Luther King, the key pictures, pictures of the books. Also, there's a section called humor, there's a section called social, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And that has been invaluable as I've gotten older and switched over to digital, that I can always open those loose leaf binders and really get a lot of information. And these days we kind of do it all on a laptop. But that's what I did. And the other part of that was when there would be a picture which I realized was really a picture that I wanted to take good care of, I would pull that strip of film out of its original roll. And I would put that, and I would create a contact sheet, what I call the master set. So all the good negatives, all the pictures that have been in books and things that are in another loose leaf binder called the master set. And I think now there may be 3 or 4 or 5 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're sort of chronological. So that all the key Woodstock negatives, all the key Martin Luther King negatives, all the key Hitchhike negatives, the best of the life story negatives and Magnum and all the different things I've done, including, after I left Magnum, those are all in what I would call the master set. So you can go, if there's a picture I feel like I need to put in a show, or a curator or director is there, then we can, make a strong cup of tea and look at those things, and we can see a lot of the criminal right there, pretty simple. And then with any luck at all, we can go find, if there is an archival print, it would be designated in a box. Or if there's a modern print of it, then we can go to the modern things and find it. So that's been something I've been
Ready for a part-time job?
over the years.
Sure, Stephen can use your skills.
I thought you said you could give your skills to him.
No, I could use my skills for a bunch of things, but
No, I think, all right.
Well, I I think that's amazing because, Stephen and I can remember when museums used to have a big card file. And basically, it was the same kind of idea as in the library, you go through and things. I would have a 3x5 card with a little 35mm contact sheet that somebody had trimmed out after they copied the image. And either stapled it or glued it onto this thing, and somebody sat at the typewriter and typed in the photographer's name, their life dates, if it was somebody who passed away, the title, the date, the process, and where we thought it was. And, those are what we used to find things. Now we have computerized databases that help you find things. But I keep coming up with the analogy that it's only as good as the last person who touched it. And so basically, if, I used to have that frustration in Houston all the time because there was several people who had access to the storage areas. And if I went to look for something and basically it was supposed to be in this certain box, and I'd go through the whole box and it wasn't there. And then I'd have to backtrack and try to figure out where it might be. And then I'd realize that basically somebody moved it, they didn't make an update, but they don't remember where it is now. So basically, how do you find it? And basically, oftentimes you'd have to just basically either hope you would come across it at some point, or if you're doing a periodic inventory, you'd come across a print that wasn't supposed to be in this box, and you'd say, well, this is the one, or this isn't the one that I was looking for earlier, but this isn't supposed to be in this box, so I have to go find out where it's supposed to be so I can put this one back and see why it says why it's in this box and not where it should be. So
I'd like to bring a couple of archival principles over to the everyday method here. The two things that drive archivists of any type, whether they're photographic or not, are two guiding principles. One's called provenance, the other is called respect to fonds, or the sanctity of original order. So the first item is provenance. If we were to get Robert Frank's collection from Robert Frank, and then we bought Robert Frank images from a dealer over here or an auction over there, we would not be taking this from here and that from there and putting it in the Robert Frank collection. The Robert Frank collection is the Robert Frank collection because that came from Robert Frank. And then there might be an ancillary collection that would be kept, on the side for the things that are gotten on here, there, and everywhere. Museums operate a little differently. These are broad generalizations, but since they do tend to get things from here and here, they tend to bring them all together, right? So from an archival perspective, it's the reason we don't integrate those is because the bigger picture, the whole picture, sometimes supplies more information than the individual parts. So if we then go to the next principle of sanctity of the original order, that order somewhere on a continuum is either total chaos because I just threw things in a box and then we have to put an order onto it, or somebody was highly organized in the way they worked, and then therefore keeping that order reflects how that person operated, how they thought about their papers or their photographs or whatever. If we bring those two concepts over to practicing photographers, organize your work by the way you operate. So if you're working on a project and you want everything from that project in one place, and you're working on another project, you know the two are very different, you may want to consider having two parts of your collection, this project and that project. When I was doing film photography, and I still do it now with digital, I just drive around and I see things and I photograph them. So I don't have a project per se. So I just used to keep mine chronologically the way I shot it. And the thing I like to remind folks is that negative can only exist in one place. It can't exist anywhere else, right? You might make several prints, and that's what the cards approach is, that there's several topics in an image. You make several prints and put them on a card, and you can follow one under one topic and one under the other, but there's still that negative in one place. So that's your root order. So when you determine how you want to keep those, then be it chronological or be it by project. If you're a shooting pro and you've got weddings and you're keeping it by client,
Whatever works for you, maintain that order for those negatives, and then know that you have these other tools available to you, like databases, like scanning your negatives and putting keywords on them. You can come at them from different angles, but have your physical item reflect the way you work first, then work with the prints secondarily. Because you might make 8x10s and then 11x14s, and 11x14s aren't going to fit in the box for 8x10s. So there's all these different reasons. If you organize, some people like to organize them, particularly slides, like to organize by subject matter. So, so you take all your pictures of the birds that you photograph and you have them here, right? And then all the automobiles over here, right? So what happens when a bird sits on top of an automobile and you take a picture of it? Where do I put this thing? I'm oversimplifying it to make the point that there's too many different angles you can come at all these things from a topical standpoint. So think more about either some kind of chronological order or whatnot for your master file, and then you can work accordingly with your prints or your index cards or your databases or whatever. Yes?
I just actually wanted to bring this into the digital world, Lightroom, let's say. Because Lightroom is known for its, organizational features and keywording and all this stuff. But I find that if I start going down that path, I'm never going to find the end of the tunnel that I'm digging for myself. So I'd like to hear maybe some of your ideas of how do you use like a base folder and this is your starting point, and then you make different collections for what you're looking for archiving, or I just want to know maybe like a digital asset management approach as far as what we're just talking, just bring it into the digital world.
Sure, and thanks for the question. So we follow what Steve's basically saying. You can pick whatever you like, but one of the things we do is have a unique serial number. It doesn't matter whether it's analog or digital. And so if there's a unique serial number, that's an index, then that only exists in one place only, back to the negative. And so if you have that digital serial number, then you can add the metadata however you like. One of the things we'll do in terms of naming files, again, analog, digital doesn't matter, is we'll often put a date on that individual file. And then, back to your specific question about Lightroom, sure, collections actually, we have a keyword set and collection set that's a structured vocabulary, so that you can put it bird and car and North Carolina and 1983 and Sally and Bob and so forth. And so the trick there is to have something that's flexible. They sell keywords, systems that are, control vocabulary is the term, that are, mass tens of thousands of terms. I don't think that's usable for, the average, people or person. So what we find is, create your main categories. I just mentioned sort of 7 of them there, and then evolve them over time and be consistent. But one of the keys, though, is to have that unique serial number so that if it does get out of order, whatever, you can then go back to that original piece.
And in Lightroom, you actually have this serial number, this original index, right? But then
yeah, actually, Lightroom doesn't do that. That's the problem. Lightroom, we've asked that forever since alpha. They don't have, inside the database they do, but it's really not accessible. So we actually have some custom plugins that you can write a script and then have that unique counter that is unique. Because as you know, if you're going back to digital photography, it rolls over, some cameras roll over in as short as 10,000 shots, which isn't a lot. So now you got, image 123 and image 123, well, what's what? So having that unique serial number really is a critical piece.
How many people, so if I can interject here, one, being cognizant of time, and two, I think there's a place you could go to find a lot of answers to your questions. Are you familiar with the website DP Bestflow?
Yes.
Okay. And the book, the DAM book?
Yep.
Okay. A lot of the questions and sub-questions that come from that are addressed there.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make sure everybody else was aware of that as well. By Peter Crow.
Yeah.